Welcome to Writing for Radio. My name is Brinkley Messick. I'm a professor at Columbia and a member of the faculty collective of the Center for Palestine Studies, CPS, which was founded in 2010. The arts are crucial to the expression of Palestinian identity and experience in the world, and CPS is committed to the encouragement and presentation of the imaginative work of Palestinian artists, especially in film and theater. The Center's theater programming, CPS Stage, launched in 2012 and active through the years since, has seen campus presentations of a series of stage readings of Palestinian plays. Writing for Radio, however, that is today's event, is the start of something new. The opening session in a more ambitious CPS theater project in a different but venerable genre, in other words, radio. Our title is No Place, La MAKAN. It's the title of the project. The project is also new in the exciting and much appreciated community that has come together around this project. First of all, a talented Columbia committee that we've never had before that developed the original conception. So Jeff Locke, Tom Casserly, who's with us today, George Bajalia with us today, Kate Wilson, and Simone Rutkowitz, who is also the program manager for CPS. Secondly, we had seed support for this new step that came from the Tides Foundation. We want to thank Peter Richards. We are most fortunate to be producing No Place, La MAKAN in partnership with the Qattan Foundation, represented by Nasreen Nafa and Mahmoud Abu Hashash, with additional support from Taawon. We also appreciate the support from the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University, with thanks to Eileen Giluli. Not least in what is new for CPS Stage is the fact that No Place, La MAKAN has commissioned new plays for this inaugural season and has engaged artistic advisors. The commissioned playwrights are Khawla Ibrahim, Ismail Khalidi, Bashar Murkus, and Dalia Taha. Our artistic advisors for this season and the speakers at this event are Selma Dabbagh and Ahmed Masoud. A final distinctive feature of No Place, La MAKAN is that the new radio plays will be translated and performed in both English and Arabic, in both New York and Palestine. Today we have Ahmed Nasser, who is our translator mutarjam, and if you want to have the proceedings translated into Arabic, you have to push on the button for a separate channel. There's an interpretation button in the lower right of the screen. Is that enough to be said about getting to the translation? I hope. I want to turn things over now to our moderator today, a theater expert and actor, George Bajalia, a recent Columbia PhD, and now an assistant professor at Wesleyan University, who will introduce Selma Dabbagh and Ahmed Masoud. And after their presentations, we will have questions. And to field your questions, we will need to see them in the Q&A, which is also on the lower part of your screen. I think it is. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to George.
Thanks very much, Brink. Thank you for the invitation to moderate today. And yes, just to reiterate, the questions for later in the session, please put them into the Q&A and we'll be monitoring them and aggregating them to be answered and discussed at the end of our time together in about an hour from now, or 45 minutes or so, an hour anyway. So I'll start by introducing Selma Dabbagh, who is going to be our first speaker today. Selma is a British Palestinian writer of fiction. She lives in London. Her writing is mainly set in the contemporary Middle East, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of the themes that reoccur for her in her writing are idealism, however futile, placelessness, political engagement or lack thereof, and the impact of social conformity on individuals. She wrote the radio play produced by BBC Radio for the Brick, which was nominated for the Emerson Award and was broadcast in January 2014, and a futuristic radio play, Sleep It Off, Dr. Shot, from December 2018 with WDR Radio in Germany, set in Gaza in 2048. After Selma, we'll be hearing from Ahmed Masoud, who's a Palestinian writer, director, and academic from Gaza and based in the United Kingdom. He's the author of Vanished, The Mysterious Disappearance of Mustafa Ouda, among other works, including 2 radio plays, Escape from Gaza, produced by BBC Radio 4 in January 2011, and Application 39, also produced by WDR Radio in Germany. We're so grateful to have both of you with us today to hear about your experiences writing for radio, and also grateful to have you as our artistic advisors in No Place by MAKAN in general. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Selma at this point.
Hi, hello everyone. Okay, I'm just gonna get some slides up so that I can talk through. Can everyone see that okay, hopefully? Okay, so today I'm gonna just be talking a bit about radio with a view to the specific demands of the medium. I have worked in, hang on, just let me sort this out so I can flick. Yeah, so is that okay? Yes. Right, so where I was going to start from, because I started writing by writing short stories and then a novel, and then I've moved a little bit since then into radio and a bit of work on scripts. So this little table here is my sort of views on the challenges of the writer getting their vision or their story across to the audience, and the in-betweeners, the people that you're working with in that process. And how, if you start off by writing prose, where you eventually, with a little bit of assistance from editors or possibly translators, you end up with a written book which goes straight into the hands of the reader, and you've got a very close relationship directly as the writer through the written word to the reader. This then varies, quite significantly with other media such as TV, film, where you could be working like in a writing room with other writers. You've got directors involved, you've got actors, you've got cameramen, you've got all kinds of decisions being made by that team who influence the way that the media, the story comes across to the audience. With TV and film, you have a whole array of visual, spoken word, special effects, CGI techniques that can be used to add to that story. Theatrical performance is quite similar, working with a dramaturg. You've also got one very specific to theatre aspect, that you've got a live audience there, you've got everybody in the same room, you've got a specific kind of connection through everybody by being there. You've got the spoken word and you've got visual, and but radio is quite specific in that it knocks out the visual. So this means that you are working basically with 3 things. You've got the spoken word, you've got sound effects, and you've got music as a basic 3 tools in your book, in your bag, so to speak. And the other limitation with both radio plays and theatrical plays, and sometimes also with film in the cinema, is that there's no possibility of referring back. You can't check back on an earlier page in the book to see if you've missed something. So it's fast moving, it's immediate, and this affects the way that you have to write for it, because you need to ground your listener, you need to get them there quite quickly. How do I do? Okay, so here's radio. Whoop. Back. Oh God, sorry. Hang on, I want to go back. So with radio, yeah, so just reinforcing what I said before, what you're doing is you're creating a fictional dimension to the story as seen in the mind's eye. You're doing that through voice, music, sound effects. There's an absence of visual image, it's a mental image you're trying to create. And if you think about that, in the context, we've all just been through lockdown, we've all been communicating with people near and far through a variety of mediums. And you might have noticed that the way that you talk to people over the phone is different to how you do it over Zoom. What you reserve for an email is also different. But I do think there's a particular intimacy about just having a voice speaking. And I think that intimacy and the way that your mind conjures up in images is something that if you ever listen to something in the dark, the way that you can see something, if you're then shown the visual image afterwards, can be quite different. It can be quite distorting. So when you write for radio, you really have to anticipate that the way that that image, that world that you're creating is being taken on by the listener could be miles apart from the way that you were seeing it. So just a note on Palestine, I'm not going to, it's a huge topic in terms of the depiction of Palestine by artists of all forms. I think there are very particular challenges with regards to Palestine. One thing, and I'd say this more from the point of view as somebody who's written novels and fiction writing, is that there's a kind of presumption in Western literature that the novel is not a political vehicle, that literature and politics are not necessarily well married. I think that in playwriting there's a little bit more of a radical, a little bit more of a revolutionary heritage as a form, but whereas with Palestinian literature, the assumption is kind of reversed to the Western one. The assumption is that the literature is political and that it's serving a national purpose. So it's for each artist to really negotiate how they deal with that expectation and how they manage that. I've got a quote there about from John Gardner, who writes a lot on writing, on writing novels in particular, and he says that true art is too complex to reflect the party line. There's a sense that propagandist writing, or writing which is sort of selling a cause, is somehow worthy. It's shied away from, which can be problematic in terms of putting forward a story set in a very political context. I think there's also an anticipation of complexity that people won't understand it. This is something that you often come across, is that people will expect that the story is too convoluted. I generally disagree. I think it's been a continuous process of more land being taken and more people being displaced, and it's whether it's happening through legal means or brutal means, it's quite a simple pattern, but that you have to somehow move away from that notion of complexity, which can and to have perhaps focus on, on less being more, on one moment in time to make it more accessible. Also an anticipation that it's very specific, that needs to be made universal, and hopelessness. Again, perhaps you need to deal with this. All of these points are fairly controversial and everybody stands on different approaches to them, but these are some of the views that I've come across and have been put to me. And then also an anticipation that it's a kind of a stuck situation, that it's stale, that it's been a long-lasting conflict, that there's nothing new, that it's, so that again is the challenge for writers to make it fresh and surprising and to test things. But in terms of opportunities, I think, as Brink said on one of our previous chats, that I do think we're living in a moment. I think that there is a change in the representation and understanding and interest with regards to Palestine. I think we have a lot we can learn from South African writers and the discussions, theoretical or otherwise, that they debated with in terms of how writers should place themselves against political conflict. And it's a conflict that people do know. Sorry, excuse the word for conflict, but it's an issue that divides the world and energizes people with a sense of association with it, that can also mean that a desire, whatever stance they take, to educate themselves further on it. In terms of, as a writer, that it is a situation of high stakes drama, the risks that people take are enormous. There are frequent life and death choices that people have to take on a very personal level, of choosing between their own personal needs and the political or societal needs as a whole. And that issue of moral conflict is one that a writer is always looking for. And then on a last point, it's just that Palestinian literature has had this really disproportionate domination of Arab literature in the last 50 or so years. There is a lot of writing that comes from Palestine, a lot of high quality writing, and this issue of resistance from the Palestinians over the last 100 years, as written about most recently by Rashid Khalidi in the 100 Years' War, is something of inspiration, you know, not just for people interested in this part of the world, but elsewhere. Just a quick note, because I write in English, so this issue of whether one is positioned as an insider, outsider writer, whether my language has determined who I can, you know, how I write. But I think that if you're going to weigh them up against each other, there are only a couple of points where really it differs in terms of how your work gets to be positioned. And that might not be something that you have full control over. It might be dictated a little bit by who publishes you, or where your work gets shown, or what language it's translated into. But the top consideration for all writers is to entertain, to grab their audience, to stimulate the reader, to create emotional connection. Underneath that, there are issues of depiction of interior realities of characters. The issue of reclaiming history and bearing witness, I think, is as relevant if you expect a wholly Palestinian audience or a non-Palestinian audience. How you place that might differ, but there is a loss of knowledge of history which is ongoing, not just externally, but through censorship processes, education systems, etc. So valid points of our history need to be rediscovered and reimagined and represented all the time. The last, on the outsider issues, I think engaging with the canon, if you're writing in English, it's something that I see a lot of writers from maybe the Global South doing, in terms of, you know, referencing points of English literature or English playwriting, or trying to find a way of connecting up with that, which is, you know, it's again, it's a stylistic thing, but it's something that is often done to try and shift Palestinian literature out of being a bracketed side issue into becoming more mainstream. The last point I put for both of them, which rings for me is the same as entertaining, is trying to create through your work either a sense of beauty, a sense of wonderment, a sense of awe, something that is quite, that hits the audience or the reader in a way that is, transforms their way of looking at things. And I've thought about this because there are writers who have talked about the lack of necessity to dwell on things like, you know, the beauty of a volcano when you've got blood running in the streets. And I'm thinking here of a Chilean poet, but I've just lost the name. And he was saying, well, how can I, you know, if we're in a situation of conflict, why should we be dwelling on, you know, the domestic or the beautiful or the, you know, a love story. But I think, you know, with Palestine, whether inside or out, that when you've had such a long ongoing struggle, that to leave out any kind of indulgence in more domestic or non-public political struggles is to leave out on, is to stop you from sort of creating the psychiatric notes of society, as I think of it as being, and to create a kind of consoling link of characters being able to see themselves in a way, in a world that they live in on a more personal level. So that's it. So I'm going to move just on to the first play that I wrote for radio, which is called The Brick. And this is the basic flowchart that I used. This was the basic process that this play came about in, that there was an idea. So I was approached, I'd written a novel called Out of It, which is set between London, Gaza and the Gulf. And this producer at the BBC read it, and she had worked in Jerusalem as a journalist where an incident had occurred to her where her stringer in Jerusalem, who was a young lady, had taken her into the city up to a house and said, I want you to go into the garden. I want to go into the garden of that house and get one brick from the garden because that house used to belong to my father. So this happened with the journalist having to go to the front door, knock on the door. There was a young Israeli woman who was obviously from London, who answered the door, and the whole scene got quite tense. So it was just a moment, but it was something that stuck in the producer's mind. So she approached me to develop the idea. So I was, in a way, I had a parameter for a story, and then it was for me to see how I wanted to develop it. So with that, I started researching, because I'd lived and worked in Jerusalem briefly in the 90s. And I wanted to look at like a journey into the city from outside, looking at all the different restrictions and the way that that journey into Jerusalem had changed. I also decided to make the character a Christian character after an interview I read with Hanan Ashrawi, and I thought that given the Radio 4 listenership, that might give a different perception or a different way in for some of the listeners. Then after we'd done all of that, I'd done that, we got to these three stages were the longest on this project: the synopsis writing, the drafting, and the redrafting to get to the final script. And it was about a year. And most of it was on the synopsis stage, because we had to keep resubmitting documents to try to get different strands of the BBC to accept our idea. There's a particular skill to writing a synopsis. It's generally not thematic. It just sets out in a very blow-by-blow way what happens in the radio play, what is the action. You can use the second person plural. You can say we are at the gate, it's 4 a.m. and then it just sort of works you through the action, each part being thought of as a scene. So it's really a lot of work went into that stage before we even knew whether it was approved and it was a goer or not. Then the drafting happened, which was a lot of exchange between myself and the producer, Sarah Bradshaw. Producers vary enormously, in my experience, in terms of their character, their amount of intervention, the way that they will expect to dictate the way that things are written. But she was very hands-on, very directive, but really made me challenge each section of each scene within the draft, asking me what the characters were doing, what were they expecting at the beginning of the scene, what would they be thinking differently by the end of the scene, how had they evolved, how had their expectations fallen, what did they feel about every other character in the room. So we went through this really forensically to try and get the movement that we wanted. That was one thing about her style. The other thing she did, which I think I've come across with others, is to not make me think about production costs or limitations at the point of drafting. So I had a child in my play, in the taxi, the service taxi, which goes around Jerusalem. And there's a general rule that you should never have animals or children, but she was like, if you need it, we can go with that. And we did, even though it was sort of very awkward for the studio and special provisions had to be made. Then final script was the drafting stage. This thing of the atmos was very interesting with this play, because I actually went specifically to the West Bank. I stayed in the residency at the Qattan Foundation, and I was given a list, like a page, 2 pages of like, get 5 o'clock in the morning, old city, 5 minutes, general background sound. So I had this Marantz recorder that I carried with me, which I would just sit there like, at the old city, like recording things, recording the sound of the muezzin. I even took a 6 a.m. journey to make sure that I got all of that right. Casting, I was not involved in. Music, she'd chosen some music by Reem Kilani from the outset. So that was something we had to kind of weave in, but it was there from the beginning. And then it went into production. With this play, basically the minute we stepped into the studio to record, I was told, your job is over, your job is done. You're not here as somebody who can comment on the way that any of the direction is going on, or how the, my opinion was not sought. And because I'd never done this before, I found that quite surprising, because I could hear these voices in my head in a very specific way. And it's a very intense and brilliant experience, really, being in a radio production studio, hearing your work being read, and one thing being acted out. And one thing I'd say about that for people who worked in theatre is you've got to realize that a lot of your actors won't read your script probably until the day before they come into the studio. Some of them, because they're working on so many other projects, will have actually only read their lines. So if you've got a very sophisticated character who is revealed as I mean, I don't know if she was very sophisticated, but I had a character of a mother who a lot of her character was revealed through conversations of others later in the script. She only had a couple of lines in the beginning, and the way that she came across in those lines I found quite flat and unnuanced, and it didn't capture all of the reveals in the later part of the script. So that was just something that I thought, the next time around I'll be more aware of. The next play that I wrote is called Sleep It Off, Dr. Shot, and this was the one that George referred to, which was set in 2048 Gaza, where I had the secular scientific enclave rising out of Gaza, and because it was futuristic in the way that my research, so it was a simpler process. I got approached by GDR, as did Ahmed, by a producer called Jan Buck, and he said, I wanted to produce these plays set in 2048. I think it was 2 Palestinian writers and 2 Israeli writers, possibly. I haven't heard the whole series. And at the time, I had already, as had Ahmed, written a story for this anthology, 100 years, the Nakba 100 years later. So again, 2048, and I was developing a story already. I'd never written anything science fiction before. I really enjoyed the experience, which is why it's great to be commissioned with an idea for a production, because it sort of stimulates you. And I started out with 2 ideas about the future that I wanted to look into. One was the idea of DNA testing and how that might feed into the law of return. And the decision as to who is Jewish or who's a Jew under the law of return. So I set it at a time when there'd been a referendum in Israel where they decided anyone with less than 50% DNA had to get out. And I had one scientist who ended up in this secular scientific enclave in Gaza. So it was a really interesting process writing this as a play, because I was already writing it as a story. The second research idea I was exploring was to do with blockchain technology and how the sort of ledger system which is involved in it could mean that financial transfers could both bypass central banks, but they could also you could mark coins ethically. So for example, if you only supported BDS, you can make sure that your money transfers and investment are all, BDS compliant, which I thought was an extraordinary idea for the future. So I was trying to find a linkage between walled in zones of the world, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere, finding a sort of monetary allegiance with each other and supporting each other. Anyway, these were my research ideas. I think it got a little bit overburdened with ideas, but the storyline was done in the way that you had a recording system going on. So even as a short story, you have a young female character who's been sent into this enclave who is narrating, so very personal to it within the radio play, saying this is what's happened, and then she's also playing back recordings as to what she, as a kind of spy, has picked up on with regards to the relationship between the Israeli scientists and the Palestinian scientists working in this place. So these 2 things were being adapted in quite different ways at the same time, with different parts of the brain, one for a short story and one for a radio play. The drafting was really straightforward. It was all over email. I just got a couple of comments back. I reworked it, sent it back in. It was then translated. I got great feedback from the director, really organized and very on point, often just asking me to express what was I seeing the resolution as being at the end, how was I, a couple of discrete but important questions. And then from there, it went on to broadcast. So the whole thing was very slick. I think it was perhaps no more than 4 or 5 months, whereas the other one was more like 18 months, I think, from beginning to end. So just as a general comment on writing for radio, I don't think it's any more complex than any other dramatic form. I don't want to overly mystify that there's some, that it's particularly challenging. I think if you can write a story that the same fundamental components, and I'll run through some of those in a minute, are there, but what is different is that it's very immediate. You can't go backwards, and you have to grab the audience like from the minute they turn on the play, because they can turn it off a lot more quickly. Radio listeners are often doing other things as they're listening to the radio, and they can switch on to music if they're in the car. So you need to, that sense of grabbing and keeping them hooked is more compelling. The temporality is connected to that intimacy, just in the way that the idea of the voice enters the body and is sort of without the sometimes disconnecting visual image which you might dissociate from. The voice can be transformed and combined with your own sort of mental images to make it very immediate, very personal in terms of its the way that it affects the audience when it's effective. And the last point I'd make is I think it's quite like the short story in terms of your possibility of being experimental, because it's a short period of time and because of the immediacy is also there. So you can set it, anywhere that you want, as long as you can take your audience there, and you can really, they might be prepared to be there for a shorter period of time than they would for like a novel, which is more lengthy. So you can really be quite experimental with it. A couple of points on characters, some of which I sort of covered when I was talking about the play, but one is that names, I think, are really key. If you've got named characters, which is quite hard to go without them, if you've got named characters, the choice of those names will be signifying a lot to the listener in terms of the age, the sex, the social status of the character being described, because there's nothing to look at. So that is something you have to think about quite carefully in terms of what you're trying to put across. When you have characters together in a room, you need them to be distinguishable from each other. So bear that in mind, that it's probably better to have them of different ages and types of voices, or speech patterns is another way that you can distinguish them, so that they're easily picked up, because it is that thing of grounding them very fast. You also would have to make choices about who you're close to in terms of the narration of the story, and stay with that person throughout, or if it's more than one person, make sure that your switch to the other person's, being proximate to the other person is clear as to your reasoning and when that happens. The other thing compared to like stage or TV is that if you've got somebody you can't have someone silent in the room. If they're in the space, if they're not heard, then it's really impossible to know that they're there. So you can't have sort of a stranger standing in the background. Moral complexity, I think, is key with characters. And then all the questions I was running through before: what do they want? What's stopping them from getting it? How do they feel about the other characters? How do they feel about their situation? How does this change throughout the play? And why should the listener care? And that goes back to, what can the listener learn from these characters? What is so universal that anybody could learn something from these characters and their conflict and that point in time? And how do you emotionally connect them? So it goes to human values, emotions, beliefs, these three things. And then on the last point is, there's a sort of a saying about writing that probably everyone's heard, but it's, you should always show, not tell. I think with radio, you can you can tell us where the characters are in a way. You need to at least show us very well where they are, and show us, but you can't tell us who they are or what they feel. It's much better if the audience is guessing what they're feeling, and that the audience is put to work to feel it with them. Plot, there's so many. I mean, there are books and books written about plot. Sorry about my slide maneuvering. Yeah, generally the idea but basic idea is you set everything up. It goes up in terms of drama, complexity, conflict, and then you have a resolution. I mean, some of these will show that with the resolution, your characters are sort of ending up in a higher place than they began. That can, it's up to you really. But the main thing is just keep, with a radio audience, is just to keep them listening. So anything you can add to put pressure on your characters helps. If they're under siege, if they're trapped in a room, if they've got, something they've got to get to. With my Jerusalem character, she had a one-day permit, which meant that she had to do everything she needed to do within the timeline of that one-day permit, and it was constantly being cut away at. So some sort of ticking clock going on helps. The other thing, to go back to short story writing, is it's sometimes quite good to start at the end, to think about a twist, the resolution, a final scene, a final note, and then to work backwards in terms of the story or the characters. But and another thing they say about writing often is you don't take the reader where they want to go. So once you've got their interest hooked, it's sometimes a good idea to kind of shift onto something else, so that they're still kept waiting on one question, and you can draw that out to introduce other characters or moments. Again, this issue of drama being the conflict of moral choice. Varieties, surprises, if you can change your scene to somewhere else, if it makes sense for the characters or the play, do something surprising, keep it alive. And yeah, and I think the other points I've covered off on, but also with your scenes, however many you have, and there's no fixed rule on that, it's just to make sure that they have their own cohesion within them. They start at a point of interest and they leave with something hanging. Dialogue is really your main, this is it, this is what you've got to really come up with. And basically it's every word counts. Every word in your script should be working at different layers. You should be helping to describe where the characters are, how they relate to each other. It should be conveying other messages, whether they're political or otherwise, but not necessarily as messages. So that it's, once, in terms of getting to those very succinct lines, you can sometimes be, sometimes I do it by writing pages just in the voice of that person, reading memoirs of people like that person I'm trying to describe, listening to interviews with people like the person I'm trying to describe, whose voice I want to capture, so that you can kind of live in their head. And even if you end up with several pages which get reduced down to just 5 lines, that will help you to capture the voice, because you want the voices to be distinguished from each other. In terms of your own lived experience, and how there's a lot of focus, writers often get asked, did this happen to you, etc. And that can make people shy away from certain lived experiences and depicting them, because they don't, maybe there's a sort of privacy issue. Maybe just take you've only got one lived experience, take it and try and infuse it in a character who's completely different to you. Try and do a what if, the question of what if, like what if I'd done it in a different way, how would that have transpired, to get you thinking about it. I know that, I know that the, in terms of speech patterns, some people are more poetic in the way that they write. I don't write poetry, but I think to look at poetry and to read poetry is very useful, just in looking at how succinct, how very reduced each choice of word is, and to use that to inform the way that you write dialogue. And the other thing is comedy. I think that when people come to Palestine, there's an automatic thought that nothing could possibly be funny, but actually some of the most moving, you know, I mean, some of the funniest people I've met are Palestinians, but also some of the most moving, tragic or political pieces of drama I've seen have an element of comedy. And I generally find that if I laugh with a character, I'm more likely to be able to cry with them. So don't veer away too much from the comedic and thinking that, you know, just because it's a serious, it might be a serious topic that you're dealing with, it can also be very funny. And then just with dialogue, keep in mind that it should be working on the level of, you've got the top text of what people are actually saying to each other, but under that you've got a subtext, sorry, what they're saying compared to what they're thinking. And what you're ideally trying to do is get the audience to pick up, the listener to pick up on what they are really thinking, so that the audience feels that they're kind of one step ahead of the way that words are being presented. Also, the idea of something being hidden often keeps a listener engaged. It's like, why aren't they, what's not being said? What is not being revealed? To keep that guesswork going. And then on the last 2 points, which are connected, it's often when you're writing, you can be hearing something in a very specific way. When it gets read by the actor, it could be entirely different. And this is part of letting it go. Sometimes you need to let it go because they actually might come up with a better interpretation than the one that you had. How much you can direct the actor is stylistic. When I first did the drafts for the BBC play, I had very detailed, ridiculously detailed instructions on how I wanted these lines to be said, and the producer basically cut that out. She said, it's confusing, it's too much. So you can be very, very pared down on directions for dialogue. Then sound effects, atmos, music. So this is all what adds to your play. These are the other you know, things in your bag that you can use. So if you would denote these on your script with this FX sound, and then you say what has happened, try to be as specific as you can in as few words as possible, but only be specific when it matters to your play. You know, if it doesn't matter whether the door is closed in any way or knocked on in any way, then just say knock at the door. You can leave it at that. But if it really is important that a character walks out and slams the door, then you should say it's a slam, because the whole scene might fall flat without it. Music is also a very powerful way of upping the emotional volume in a play. And you may or may not, as a writer, be involved in those decisions. I had one scene which I felt fell flat because I had settlers who'd taken over a house in Jerusalem playing very loud music, and forcing my characters to shout at each other over this noise and this harassment from the settlers. But because the noise was toned down, and because shouting in a radio play is actually a very difficult thing to carry off, because it's less, your listeners are already very engaged. It's too hard to take on if you're not already emotionally connected to the characters, and it just sounds annoying and kind of hammed up. So how that music is moderated is important. Some studios have things called dead rooms, which means that there's no sound, so there's no echo, so that it sounds like the characters are outside. And then anything like street noise and the atmos that I picked up in Jerusalem can be added in later to give that really realistic effect. I think that's it. And then I there are a lot of books on writing for radio. These are some plays on occupation and dispossession, on Palestine by Hannah Khalil and Hassan Abdul Razak. I would also say, if you're interested in radio, you can read books on writing in any genre for ideas. You'll find that there's a lot of crossover in the kind of tips that are given about how to write. Oh, sorry, I've gone over time, but that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Selma. And actually, thanks for sharing those resources right at the end too, about writing for radio, just to say briefly, we have a couple of questions about examples of radio plays, radio play scripts, and that sort of thing. So there will be some resources put on the Center for Palestine Studies website that address those questions, just links, I think, is what I'm hearing. And just to say that will be there. But anyway, I want to turn it over to Ahmed Masoud now. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Selma, and thanks, Ahmed.
Thank you. Thanks, George. And thanks, Selma, for this amazing presentation. I think I have very little to contribute or to add to this because I think it covers everything, to be honest with you. But that was all planned, of course. What I would like to do here today is to just talk more about my personal experience, both in terms of writing generally for theatre, but also for radio plays, obviously, because that's the theme of this webinar. So I've got some slides as well I'm going to share with you. I'm sorry if it's going to be death by PowerPoint, but I am going to be brief because I realize that we are running out of time and we need to open up for the Q&A later on. So I'll just kind of whiz through the slides very quickly. Just bear with me while I get this ready and just talk them through. I'm a bit sorry. There we go. So just very briefly, you've heard the introduction already, but my name is Ahmed Masoud, and I'm a Palestinian from the Gaza Strip. And the reason I'm just reintroducing myself a little bit here is because I grew up in Gaza and I had not seen theater before, an actual physical theater, because we didn't have one. And I had not heard radio plays before. We had a radio, my dad loved the radio, but all we listened on the radio was the news, of course. It was the quickest update. It was our Twitter at the time. But for me, I grew up sort of like in a situation where the environment around me sort of affected me quite a lot. The kind of the landscape, the scenes around me really affected everything in my journey from Gaza to London. The first time I saw a theatre, an actual theatre in London, was at the Theatre Royal Haymarket in the West End here. I did not really believe myself because I was working as a front of house staff, like carrying an ice cream tray and just waiting for the doors to open. So I had a peek in the window just to see what's happening in there. And I saw these giant people standing on stage and I was like, what is this massive screen, or what is that exactly? And I promise you, for a few seconds, I didn't know whether I'm imagining real people in there or I'm looking for a screen that I could touch or not. That was my sort of first experience with theatre. Of course, we had a theatre in Gaza later on that was built around 2008 or 2009, which was later bombed by the Israeli occupation in 2018. So we still have no theatre now, a functioning physical theatre in Gaza. So I grew up around me with images, recurring images of ruins, basically. Everywhere I looked around me, and every time Gaza got rebuilt, the same scenes come back to mind. Of course, Gaza is not like that. Gaza is a beautiful place. I grew up in an incredibly beautiful place. It's a Mediterranean city. It's lovely. We've got the beach, we've got the sand and everything, and it's quite green actually. But every 4 years, every 3 years, that's the image you see, and that sticks with you wherever you go. And how do you actually describe this for radio? How do you actually talk about this for radio? And that's something I would like to cover later on a little bit in terms of how do you actually transfer the landscape and the surrounding environment into a blind medium, as Selma said. You know, you've removed the visuals completely, and now you have to go and tell the audience. But of course, as Selma said, you can't tell, you have to show. But how do you show? How many times can you mention the word rubble, for example, or occupation, or a checkpoint, etc., etc.? Images like these, for example, where they're incredibly hard to describe because nobody has seen this before. That's another thing. It's not part of the audience or the reader's imagination to find a house which is completely upside down. You know, no matter how much you say it or refer to it, it's difficult to show. Or sort of some of the kids playing around, or some of the, you know, the landscape and how it changes from being rubble to a tent being built up to a house. It's something that has stayed with me and in my work all the time, because for me, occupation has always been faceless. I've never been able to describe your occupation. It has no medium to show or tell or to say this is what it is. It's a number of things. It's a set of unjust rules and practices against my people and against myself. So in my theater work, I've always had soldiers, for example, with masks. I've never actually given them faces because I don't know what they look like. I've always seen soldiers behind Ray-Ban glasses, for example. I've always seen them in uniform. There is no humanity to them, which is quite hard to describe. And it's hard to describe for radio or writing specifically. But theater, for example, is much easier because all you need to do is just put a mask on. I should say in here that, yes, writing for radio, when I first did my first radio play, Escape from Gaza, back in 2011, I found it very scary. I found it an incredibly scary process because, as I said, I'd never heard radio plays in Gaza before. There was a program, I think maybe some of the Palestinian audience here today remember, there used to be a crime radio drama by a Syrian radio station called Hukm al-Adala, which is means the rule of justice. And it's basically like a kind of Sherlock Holmes style set in Syria and Damascus. But it was, we sometimes got it through the waves and we have to go on the aerial and get, you know, the Syrian radio. But really, I don't think many people listen to it. And as I grew up in Gaza, I mean, theater became more kind of popular. And in fact, with the rise of Hamas into power in Gaza, the funny thing about Hamas is that they actually use a lot of drama for their speeches, for their festivals, their weddings and everything. So we actually see loads of masked men on stage acting, which is basically, if you can't see somebody's face, it becomes like radio drama because you have to rely on the words and the imagination itself. Throughout my work, again, this is for a play I did on Syria. I went to the biggest refugee camps for Syria in Jordan, Al-Amari refugee camp, and all I could see is these boxes and this desert and like this kind of stark reality in there. So as I said, for theater, it's much easier to represent that. It's kind of, you imagine, you see what's happening. For example, you're looking here in the desert and looking at this refugee camp, and all I could see when I went there was just lines. And all I wanted to do was to represent that again on stage by creating lines in there. But of course, you can't do this for radio. But it's important to remember that radio is just a vehicle. If I can't do this with radio, what else can I do? How can I describe it differently to the audience to express exactly that people there are living in boxes, in lines, they're restricted by movement, etc. Now, if you walk to a theater stage and you go in there, I don't think you would get that reference quite quickly. The audience didn't quite get it at the beginning of this play. As the play developed, they sort of started to see the importance of those lines on stage. So even with actual live theater, it's very difficult to really get the sense of the metaphors and the representation and the visual effects, as it were. So you still have to be careful about how you create them and how much you show, because there's nothing worse than a full-blown set that shows a prison or a bedroom or something. It becomes like an Egyptian Adil Imam play, you know, where you've got the whole set built in there. And for me, it doesn't really feed the imagination that much. So again, remember in here with radio drama, what you're doing is you're replacing all of that by words and music and the different sort of building blocks that Selma talked about in terms of sound effects, in terms of music, in terms of the journey that you represent there as well. Again, this is just another example of how the lines were represented and how people were living in simple, small places. Again, you know, with the kind of port being destroyed a few years ago in Gaza, this landscape is always going to stay with me. It's always going to be, you know, part of my work and my identity. And part of the challenges that I go through in terms of how do you explain this as a Palestinian, how do you actually represent this for radio or for stage at the same time. So in terms of tips for writing for radio, there are so many of them, of course. These are actually from the BBC itself, because I did a a playwriting competition with them last year. I didn't win. I didn't get into the final either, but it got shortlisted. My play got shortlisted sort of a number of times. And these are some of the stuff that kind of they sent us as part of the guidance, which really kind of summarizes quite a lot of what Selma talked about in more details. Again, the ones that I would like to pick up on is the expressing of the visual elements, which what I've been talking about before. Is how are you going to tell this visual element? How are you going to say to your audience what you're going to describe to them? Especially that if it is something that is not so familiar to people. When it goes to science fiction, for example, if you have, I don't know, a creature that you create that nobody knows about and nobody has seen before, how do you actually describe them without describing them too much? So you need to be aware of that sort of mechanism and that method, because that is really going to make a huge difference to your writing. But for me, again, I want to stress that it's just a vehicle in here. I don't think people who write for radio should really worry about, all of these things, because for me, the first thing is write and write and write. And the most important tip here is the last one, which is enjoy writing your play, because we all have, interesting stories to tell. We all have themes to tell. And just get into it and really get to know your characters, get to know your plot. On number 5 in there, it says, when I read that, I was like, what does that mean? Get under the skin of your characters. I mean, for me, it's really knowing them so much and knowing them so well, because what happens in the process of creating a radio play is that it gets edited a lot, like 100 times almost, and you need to know where to cut and where to sort of like leave it and where to edit. And if you don't know the whole journey, you don't know the kind of character or the CV of the character, you can miss out quite a lot. So when you start with a play and you've got the script, by the time it goes to production, it's a completely different script almost. It's the nature of the beast, because you have the producer, you have the engineers, you have the actors, you have everybody just making comments and suggesting things. And something that I really sort of care about a lot, which is not just for radio, but also for sort of drama and, novels and everything, is just always express your characters between the dialogue and interaction. You don't have to tell us who you are. You don't have to tell us what the character is and where they are in a sense. Let other people do it. Let the dialogue carry that and the interaction of what's happening, etc. So I'd really recommend that the character, when you start, and as Selma sort of showed in there, it's almost like build a CV to them, just write what they are, how old they are, what they like, what they don't like, what is the last 5 years or 3 years of work experience, where have they been, who are their friends. I tend to do that quite a lot for my work, because then I know where to jump from if I need to, and I know where to kind of get back to as well. I think what I will add to this one is listen to radio drama, maybe not the Archers on BBC, I think that's terrible, but listen to radio drama, find it online and try to listen to it. And nowadays, actually, what is happening with the rise of audiobooks, for example, with Audible as an application that a lot of us have, actually, a lot of the books and novels are being read as a radio drama. A lot of, the production companies, they're using actors, very, very good actors, actually, because it's good work for them. And they're using music, they're using all the elements that a radio drama does use, So even that is quite actually useful for you to listen to a book, to an audiobook. I do that all the time. I'm always listening to audiobooks when I'm cycling or when I'm commuting, etc., because you've got something right in your ear and you're listening about the imagination and how it is read. It's about knowing how the words and the script will be read as well. So one of the challenges for me, as I said, was around describing sort of scenes and places within Gaza. This is just an example from the play that Selma talked about, Application 39, which was set in the future for WDR in Germany. It was about really describing something really specific and unique to Gaza. which is a sculpture right in the middle square of Gaza City. And it just doesn't make sense because the sculpture, which I think, I'll let you read for a second first, and then I'll show you the picture because it doesn't actually look what it is. Even people in Gaza don't know, a lot of them don't know what it is. I definitely had to research it and find out what it is. And it's about the scene of those two men, you know, the play was kind of set in the future, 2048, and it's about a couple of young Palestinian IT geeks in the municipality building who just for a joke submit an application to the ICO, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, for Gaza to host the Olympics, the 39th Olympics. And just as it happens, they win somehow because they've hacked the French application, copied it exactly, and just changed it to Gaza, and they submitted it. And then there was this big hoo-ha in there. It's like, what do we do? Who submitted this? What the heck is all of this about? And they get into trouble. They're called in, and just before they go in there, they're going around that sculpture, just basically thinking about their story, how they're going to defend themselves in front of the president of Gaza City, because my kind of imagination of Gaza in 2048 that is even more divided into various states between the north and the south and the middle as well. So very often in radio drama, you actually have a lot of writers use this, and I use it a lot. I've used it in this play, and I've used it in the other play, the BBC play, Escape from Gaza. You tend to have a one narrator voice. It's almost like making it like a one person show, one woman show, one man show, where somebody is narrating in there. In this case, it was Lama here, who's the kind of voiceover, who's carrying out the story. This is actually quite the norm now with radio plays. The more I listen to them, you know, and I listen to a lot of them every day. There's a 2:15 play radio drama afternoon in the BBC every day. It's an easier technique, so you can use that quite easily. Somebody who's a character observing and taking the listeners through the story, but they have to be really engaging. And again, like Selma gave all the tips before, grab your audience right from the beginning. So this is the sculpture that I was talking about. This is right in the middle of Gaza City, and it's the lower jaw of the phoenix, the bird phoenix, because the phoenix is the actual official symbol of Gaza City, which really represent that this city will always be reborn from the ashes, as the phoenix is. And as the myth goes, apparently, that the jaw is the first part of the phoenix that comes back to life before the whole bird comes back to it, which is, I mean, it's a great sort of metaphor and a great sculpture. And it's great to know that Gaza will always be rebuilt, but the bad news is that it will always be destroyed as well. So kind of trying to represent that is also challenging. So kind of that scene, how do you actually describe this? You know, I don't know if that was successful. I mean, you read it in there on the screen, but it's around sort of creating that sense of something. There's something strange, and those two people are doing something slightly odd, as it were. I want to give another sort of example of the building blocks that Selma was talking about in terms of the vehicles you can use, in terms of the music, the sound effects. And I'm going to go back to my play, Escape from Gaza. I just need to play it differently. And please tell me if you can't hear the music. I'm just going to play a minute or so of it, if that's okay.
Ahmed, listen, the border's opened for 3 days only. Tariq's coming in a taxi with your
What about saying goodbye?
No time for that. Leave Dudo with Uncle Mahmoud. Keep trying the minister, get Heather to ring the embassy. Try anything you can think of.
We're racing to Rafah now. I'm ringing the minister every few minutes, still no answer. Just try the embassy again, love.
They swear they've done everything they can.
Okay, tell them this could be my last chance. Tell them I'm invited for tea at Buckingham Palace, anything.
Okay, I'll tell them I've gone into labour.
Tariq and I have been sitting for 3 hours outside the first gate. I can't get through to the minister. Everyone's phoning everyone they've ever met.
Okay, I'll tell him. Ahmed, Khaled's spoken to a guy on the main gate. He says he'll try and get you through.
But there's 2 gates to get through first. These guys won't let me.
Well,
it's hopeless. Let's just wait and see if the minister phones. After all day waiting in the sun, we're back in the taxi heading home. Home. For the first time since coming to Gaza, I am absolutely desperate for a drink.
Here, listen, I brought this for you.
Ah, good choice. Oh, where can you get the beer around here?
Wale! Wale!
They
So basically, that was just to give you an idea of the different mediums that you can use in there. And that is when you're writing, it's just basically my tip in there is just write, because these things can be added in later. If you're writing in the scene is in the car, you know that you've got so many effects in there. When you kind of in a room, there are so many sound effects there as well, from door slamming to glasses to whatever it is. There's always sound around us. But the great thing about music specifically is that it makes you jump in time. It makes you go from one point to the other quite quickly. It's a vehicle basically for moving both the plot and time. I'm gonna stop here. Actually, I'm not gonna go for the rest of the slides because I realize that we only have 20 minutes. And in any way, I'm coming to the end of my talk in here, which I hope you found useful. But I think, yeah, I will stop here. And I hope that I gave you a sense of where I am in terms of the writing sort of stage. And also you found some useful tips there as well.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And thank you both for these really comprehensive looks at what it's like to write for radio. I have a couple of questions that maybe I'll start with, and then we can move from discussion into questions from our audience as well. So I know you were both part of this project that was imagining Palestine in 2048, right? And in that sense, thinking with science fiction and radio is something that obviously has a deep history within radio and radio drama as well. So I wanted to ask, is there a sense of, in the works, specifically the works for this collection, but maybe more broadly as well, how do you engage with the history of radio drama? Or do you see the work that you've done as more in conversation, in parallel to other sort of contemporary audio projects, whether it's audible books or podcasting? There's all these sort of fiction podcasts that are popular as well. Do you see for instance, with the science fiction projects, did you see them more in that history of, radio drama science fiction, or more in that world of audio that we maybe all live in now? And that's for either of you, I guess.
I can kick off with just sort of commenting briefly on this. I think, yes, you do enjoy, like with its writing science fiction. I suppose both Selma and I was our first experience in writing science fiction. So I'm definitely not an expert about sort of writing science fiction in here. But I suppose I found it easier for radio specifically, because you can create and do things much easier because they rely on sound and imagination. So you don't have to build an actual robot, for example. I had robots in my play, I had vehicles, flying cars, I had loads of things in there. I had lifts that sort of go down the kind of underground tunnels in Gaza, and then they sort of shoot you off in Amman and Egypt. I mean, if I was to create this for cinema, it would have been very, very expensive to produce. I need to be Tom Cruise or somebody to kind of get that produced. But for radio, it was a much easier way, because it was about kind of telling the audience and describing them through some medium in there. So in that scene in the lift, they press a button, and then there's an automated voice that asks questions. Where would you like to go? Press this button for Amman, press that button for Cairo, that button for, whatever. So it's kind of very, very simple. And then suddenly the audience is like, oh, wow. So that is sort of futuristic in there. I think science fiction and radio go hand in hand, as you said. But I suppose the other thing one need to be careful about is that not to create too many unfamiliar things, because as we said before, is describing the visual is quite important. We need to establish what it is right from the beginning, grab the audience, establish those those themes, and then they will forgive you for anything you do after that.
Yeah, thank you. Selma, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I must say, to be honest, I hadn't been as aware of like the sort of theoretical background or the connection between science fiction and radio. But I mean, for all the reasons that Ahmed was describing, I think that just the fact that you're not limited by production costs to create something very imaginative, and it's a natural fit. I think where it's really difficult is if it's complicated, as science fiction often is, because the writers go off in these furrows of the imagination about what could be happening, and that it's quite difficult to ground your listener well enough. So I was more concerned about adapting it to the short sort of memory span and the short form than perhaps tying it into an existing tradition. I thought there would be more exchange with the producer perhaps to guide me on that, and I'm not entirely sure as to how well it worked because it's only been produced in German, and obviously I know what's going on, so I can't judge it. But yeah, I would say that it was. Sometimes as a writer, you're constantly you're always a little bit hustling in terms of the jobs that you get and how much sort of you can research them before you start writing, and sometimes you just have to throw yourself in there without perhaps as much knowledge of what came before and what particular experiments could have taken place than you would have liked, ideally. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. And just to follow up with that, on something you mentioned right now is sort of, earlier you were talking about subtext, right? And writing with the sort of top text and the subtext. And it strikes me that it's particularly important in writing for radio to sync subtext with words and not with stage directions, right? Because, in a sort of classic Chekhov type of play, right, whoever it is walks across the stage and cuts a piece of cheese very slowly, and that's written into the text that he's cutting cheese for the next 15 minutes of the scene, whatever it is, right? And that doesn't come across in radio. So all of these other things that we're talking about, whether it's the automated elevator or it's the street noise that you're adding in some ways are also the subtext of the radio play, the subtext of the environment, and that sit alongside the subtext of the characters, right? So I guess, how did you in your experiences think with that, creating that kind of environment specifically? And how did you write even the continuity of the environment? I noticed there was one suggestion you had about if you're outside, make sure you're in a dead room so you don't have an echo, right? I mean, just the depth of that sort of thing. Did you search for sort of continuity of scenes between these different places, or how did you write each room almost, I guess is what I could be asking.
Again, I can pick up on this as well. I don't think I necessarily thought this is what I wanted to do and set out to do in a way. I think for me, the story is the most important thing. It's what is it that I'm trying to say? What is the plot? Where are they going? Where are they heading? Why am I even writing this play in the first place? And whether it's for radio or for stage, it's kind of doesn't matter really. It's later on, it's that editing process, is that amazing process of really kind of shaping something you have. Once you've created that story and that plot and where you're going and everything, then you kind of think about, well, actually, this needs to be outside, this needs to be inside, this needs to have these effects, etc. I worked with some really good sound engineers before, for example, just to pick up on the effects side of things. Their advice was that actually the best effects is that when the audience don't even notice that they're there. The moment they notice that they're there, they're actually really bad. So in a way, that is a really good advice, because what it means is that it means that they don't actually matter. They add in a lot to the experience. They're bringing a lot to the experience of listening, etc. But actually, you can do the whole play without it, and the story and the words should carry, no matter how you play it and how you present it separately. I've written a number of one-person shows. My last was the Shroud Maker, and it is very much a woman on the stage telling a story. You know, it is a radio format in a sense, because it's all about words, and there's a lot of sound effects there as well. The actor has been amazing. She's done it with sound effects and she's done it without sound effects, and both have been quite effective and successful as well. We've done it on Zoom and it worked, you know. So, and that's the thing about technology now and what we're doing and how radio drama is being affected, is that actually, where is it going to be in the next year or so after this pandemic, and after we've done stuff on Zoom and things have evolved? I think they will be affected a little bit. And I know I'm digressing from the sort of the question, but that's my view on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say with my sci-fi play, it was I had two settings and I needed to make sure that they sounded very different from each other. They're both inside quite similar places, but they had to sound distinctive. One had a window which opened and closed. You had some drone sounds and it was a lab. And the other was this bunker where the woman was playing back the recordings of the lab. So because there was flashback, which is always risky to use, to go back in time chronologically, I needed to make sure that crossover between the spaces was distinguished. That was my key concern, but they seem to have carried that out. With the play where I was actually in the studio, they were asking me what I thought of the sounds at the time. And I wish I'd had more confidence to intervene a little bit more, because I did have views on them, whereas I wasn't asked to comment on the actors. So, and I think it depends a lot on who you're actually with us in terms of sound effects, you know, the sound manager, their personality, how they'll let you in and how you can influence them. But it can make or break a scene, I think. You know, I mean, I hear what Ahmed's saying as well, but it depends I think it depends on the play as well. I think some scenes for me wouldn't have worked without the right background noise. You know, if somebody's saying what's that and there's no music playing, it's a problem, you know. It's like, anyway, so, yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah, that makes sense. And I think that one of the things that we're asking ourselves in this webinar, seminar, as well as in the larger No Place Like MAKAN project is, you know, what types of writing are we going to be seeing and broadcasting and producing? And, you know, well, I'm going to turn to a question on that note from Nurhan Kazak, who's interested in experimental writing and wondering maybe I can reframe this. How experimental can you be when you're doing writing for radio, you know, without disorienting the listener? I don't know how experimental either of you have tried to be in your writing for radio, or, you know, Selma, you were mentioning getting too complex can then sort of distort it all a lot. So how would you respond to this? Yeah, how experimental can you be without disorienting the listener?
Gosh, I mean, I think if you've got the concern about keeping the listener grounded, some people listen much better than others, and some people read much better than others. And I think you have to kind of go like pitch it for somebody middling, who's kind of like halfway, you know, not particularly attentive, but try and get them and just ground. If it is an unusual setting, if there's a good reason why it's unusual or experimental, I think radio can be you can be extraordinarily experimental in terms of unfolding where the characters are situated very gradually for a purpose, you know. But to carry that off, it would take, there needs to be a good reason for it, and there needs to be a hook and a connection to the characters. Maybe limit your characters and make the chronology a straightforward one rather than one that jumps back in time. So I think it's like lots of moving objects. If you've got one thing which is you're trying to put across, say, a very complicated political scene, I think then sometimes you need to reduce down the other variables, like keep the other things simpler. Or if you've got a very experimental setting, just maybe have two voices which are very different from each other, and don't play around with the timeline as well. I mean, you could make other adjustments to try to get across, if being experimental and diverse in terms of, your setting, your world is your key focus, then try to find other ways of making the other aspects of the place perhaps easier to follow. But emotional connection for me, I think, is really key, as well as intellectual curiosity. But I think for a drama, without emotion isn't really a drama. It's more of a sort of a lecture or an exploration or a read short story, and so if you want drama, you do need the tension, but maybe reduce it down. Sorry, so a bit long-winded. Ahmed? Yeah.
I think you answered that perfectly well, to be honest with you. I think because, radio drama relies on drama and relies on conflict and relies on that emotional sort of conflict in general. I think you definitely can be experimental, but radio drama in itself is experimental. You can jump in time zones, you can jump in mediums, in vehicles, as we discussed before. You can write science fiction, all of these things. So it depends on what you mean by experimental. Is it within form? So you can write prose and sort of like fiction and poetry at the same time, or make it more kind of, is it stylistic, or what is the experiment there? So I think that you need to decide, I think, on two things. One, what is my theme? What is it that I am saying? And then what is my experiment in there? I think I would love to see that myself, and I would love to try that. One of the proposals I'm working with the BBC on at the moment is just taking ages, of course, because we haven't touched, or Selma, you touched on that a little bit, but also as a writer, there's the challenge of production as well. When you get there, is to try to convince somebody of your work, trying to actually get them to buy into what you've written. And there's a play I'm set in Egypt I'm working on at the moment, but and it's kind of experimental because it goes into various countries and different themes and different writing style, but it's hard to convince the producer to see it of how it is going to happen, and he keeps coming back to me with questions after questions after questions, and I'm just like exhausted now. It's just like, just trust me with it. I can, once you've seen it, it'll be brilliant. But of course, they're invested into making it happen, and they have costs, so they need to make sure it does happen. So yeah, it depends on the kind of experiment really, and how much it is groundbreaking, or is it just about format, vehicles and tools, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. I'm going to turn to another audience question here from Jim Dingeman. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Who seems to actually be a radio producing expert. So, but who's curious about the sort of history of radio and radio drama in the Middle East in general. I don't know if either of you want to speak to that, or even perhaps Brink, if you have certain thoughts on that too. But Ahmed, go ahead.
The history of radio drama in the Middle East. Yeah, I mean, I think the main one that I know of, and I grew up with, as I said, is that Syrian radio drama. It was every Wednesday or so, and it was big in Syria, not in Palestine. I think, a lot of the radio sort of literature vehicle were more poetry, and for Palestine was definitely relied on poetry and music mostly, especially because radio was very important for the kind of disconnected Palestinian community, especially after 1948, where Palestinians were divided, and a lot have left their country, became refugees, and ended up in different places. In fact, there was a radio program where people used to send messages to each other in Jordan and in Syria and others. In case you're listening, your uncle so and so says hello, and your uncle had a child, and all of that. So that's how people used it. But of course, in the 60s, 70s, with the rise of Mahmoud Darwish as a poet, a lot of his poetry gigs were being kind of aired. And that was the main sort of literary form for radio that I used to listen to, not in the 70s, I wasn't born then, but later on. It was just kind of like sitting down and listening to an evening of poetry with Mahmoud Darwish, and then you have Marcel Khalifa, who is the legendary Palestinian musician, playing next to him. So that's been sort of my kind of knowledge and experience of radio drama in the Middle East, but I could be completely wrong, and I completely have missed it because I wasn't listening enough.
And I think, you know, there's another part of the question that I didn't totally see, but radio drama today, I think that's kind of what how rich and diverse are traditions of radio drama today as well. I think that's kind of what we're experimenting with right now.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean,
I should add very quickly that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I should add that there are a number of radio dramas in Palestine at the moment. You know, various radio stations. They actually, Al Aqsa Radio does produce regular radio dramas in Arabic as well. Actually, in fact, I was listening to one when I was in Gaza back in April, and I was like, oh wow, that's amazing. Really, I would like to know more about the people who are creating them and stuff. And it's similar to what you know of radio drama, albeit needs a lot of work, in my opinion, when I listen to it.
Excellent. Well, I think we're almost out of time. It's just about, 6:30 for those of us who are in that time zone, and 1:30, and whatever, a bunch of different time zones here. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you for these questions. Thank you, Selma and Ahmed, for sharing your experiences and your knowledge and the advice with us today, and throughout the project in general. And I don't know if I need to pass this back to somebody else or if I will close the event, but thank you all for joining us, and please subscribe to the Center for Palestine Studies mailing list, where you can stay updated with both this event as well as lots of other excellent events to come, and you'll hear when these plays are actually going to be broadcast, and you'll be able to listen to them. So yeah, thank you very much.